children throw their 87-year-old father into the sea for his inheritance. But fate had a terrible surprise in store for them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the deck of the Silver Haven, a 40-foot yacht that had been Richard Morrison's pride and joy for nearly 3 decades. At 87 years old, Richard stood at the stern, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he watched the Florida coastline shrink behind them. The salt air filled his lungs, a sensation he'd loved since he was a boy, fishing off the pier in Pensacola with his own father. "Dad, you should sit down," called his daughter, Patricia, from the flybridge where she stood beside her brother, Michael. "The water's getting choppy." Richard turned to look at his children. Patricia was 58 now, her blonde hair touched with gray, despite her efforts to hide it. Michael, 2 years younger, had their mother's build stocky and solid. They both wore expensive sunglasses and resort wear that looked fresh from the store. Richard couldn't remember the last time either of them had actually enjoyed a day on the water. They'd always been too busy with their careers, their own families, their separate lives in Atlanta and Charlotte. "I'm fine, sweetheart," Richard said, though he did ease himself onto the cushioned bench. His knees weren't what they used to be, and the rocking of the boat required more balance than he could muster standing. It had been Patricia's idea to take this trip, a family day. "Dad, just the 3 of us, like old times." Richard had been surprised, but pleased. After Margaret passed 2 years ago, the silence in the big house had grown heavy. His children called dutifully every Sunday, but those conversations never lasted more than 10 minutes. This invitation felt like a bridge being rebuilt. The yacht cut through the turquoise water, heading farther from shore. Richard closed his eyes and let himself drift back to better times. He remembered teaching both kids to swim in these very waters. Michael, screaming with delight as each wave lifted him. Patricia, more cautious but determined. Margaret had sat in the captain's chair, laughing, her sundress billowing in the breeze. "Those were good days," Richard murmured to himself. "What was that, Dad?" Michael appeared beside him, holding 3 bottles of beer. He offered one to Richard. "Just remembering," Richard said, accepting the cold bottle. "Your mother loved it out here." Michael's expression flickered something Richard couldn't quite read. "Yeah, she did." They drank in silence for a moment. The engine's steady hum provided a comforting rhythm. Richard studied his son's face, noticing the tension around his eyes, the way he kept glancing back at Patricia. "Everything all right with you, son?" Richard asked. "You seem worried about something." "Everything's fine, Dad." Michael's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just work stuff. You know how it is." Richard did know. Michael ran a real estate development company that had been struggling for years. Patricia's husband had been laid off 6 months ago, and her art gallery was barely breaking even. Richard had helped them both numerous times over the years: college tuitions, down payments, business loans that were never repaid. He'd never asked for the money back. They were his children. That's what fathers did. But lately, he'd sensed something different in their phone calls. Questions about his health, about the house, about his plans for the future. He dismissed it as natural concern. But now, watching Michael avoid his gaze, Richard felt a cold thread of unease. Patricia climbed down from the flybridge, and Richard noticed she'd changed into a wetsuit. "Dad, we thought we'd anchor here for a bit. Maybe go for a swim. The water's beautiful." Richard looked out at the endless blue. They were at least 3 miles from shore now, farther than he'd usually venture. "I don't know, honey. That's pretty deep water for swimming." "Oh, come on, Dad," Patricia said, her voice carrying that bright, false cheerfulness he recognized from her teenage years, the tone she'd used when she wanted something. "Remember how you always said swimming in the ocean was like being held by the whole world? Besides, we brought you a life vest." Michael was already dropping anchor. The yacht settled, rocking gently in the current. Richard felt that unease growing stronger, but he pushed it down. These were his children, his own flesh and blood. "All right," he said, "but I'm only going in for a minute. These old bones don't handle cold water like they used to." Patricia helped him into the life vest, cinching it perhaps a bit too tight. Michael had already jumped in, treading water 20 feet from the boat. The sun was high now, glinting off the waves in 1,000 tiny mirrors. Richard sat on the swim platform, letting his legs dangle in the water. It was cooler than he expected, and for a moment, he hesitated. Something felt wrong. The way Patricia stood behind him, the way Michael had swum away from the boat instead of staying close. "Dad," Patricia said softly, and there was something in her voice, something sad and desperate and terrible. "I'm sorry." Before Richard could turn, he felt her hands on his shoulders. A push, not gentle. The water swallowed him whole. The shock of submersion drove the air from his lungs. Richard surfaced, sputtering, his heart hammering against his ribs. The life vest kept him afloat, but when he looked back at the yacht, he saw Patricia climbing aboard. Michael was swimming toward the boat, not toward him. "Wait," Richard called out. "What are you doing?" The engine roared to life. Richard watched, unable to believe what he was seeing, as the Silver Haven began to pull away. "Patricia, Michael," his voice cracked. "Come back." Patricia stood at the stern, her hand raised in what looked almost like a wave goodbye, or maybe an apology. Richard couldn't tell. The yacht picked up speed, and within moments, it was a white speck on the horizon. He was alone. The reality settled over him like a weighted blanket. His children, his own children, had left him here, abandoned him. No, worse than that. They'd planned this. The family trip, the beer, the swim, all of it orchestrated. The inheritance, Richard realized with stunning clarity. They wanted the house, the investment accounts, the life insurance, everything. And they decided not to wait. For several minutes, Richard simply floated, too shocked to feel anything but numb. The water lapped at his face. Seabirds called overhead. The sun beat down mercilessly. Then, beneath the shock, something else began to stir. Not panic, though he knew he should be panicking. Not even anger, though that would have been justified. What Richard felt was a profound, aching sadness. He'd failed them somehow. Failed to teach them that love wasn't something you could measure in dollars. That family meant showing up, being present, caring for each other, not because of what you might gain, but because connection itself was the treasure. Margaret would have been heartbroken. Richard closed his eyes. His arms and legs were already growing tired from the effort of keeping himself oriented. Even with the life vest, he was 87 years old, floating in the Gulf of Mexico, 3 miles from shore. He knew what the outcome would be: hypothermia, exhaustion, eventually unconsciousness. The Coast Guard might find his body in a few days. His children would play the grieving family, would collect their inheritance, would probably convince themselves they'd done what they had to do. A strange peace settled over him. He thought of Margaret, of her final days when she'd held his hand and whispered, "What a beautiful life we had." They had. They really had. 52 years of marriage. Countless sunrises, more laughter than tears. 2 children who, whatever else might be said, had been loved completely. Maybe that was enough. Richard let himself float, conserving energy, watching the clouds drift across the endless blue sky. An hour passed, then another. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. His lips were cracked and dry. His skin felt tight and hot despite the water. He was starting to drift in and out of consciousness when he heard the engine. At first, Richard thought he was hallucinating, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. He forced his eyes open and saw a small fishing boat cutting through the waves, heading directly toward him. "Hey, over here," a man's voice, loud and urgent. "I got someone in the water." Strong hands grabbed Richard's arms. 2 men, both young, maybe in their 30s, hauled him up into their boat with surprising gentleness. One immediately wrapped him in a blanket, while the other radioed the Coast Guard. "Sir, can you hear me?" The first man, Hispanic, with kind eyes, leaned close. "What's your name?" "Richard," he managed. "Richard Morrison." "I'm Carlos. This is my brother Tony." "We got you, Mr. Morrison. You're safe now." Richard learned later that Carlos and Tony Hernandez had been on their way back from a fishing trip when Tony spotted something in the water. "Thought it was a buoy at first," Tony said. "But Carlos has better eyes. Said it looked like a person." They'd called it in before they even reached him. By the time they got Richard back to the marina, an ambulance was waiting. So was the Coast Guard. And so, surprisingly, were Patricia and Michael. Richard saw them standing by the dock as the fishing boat pulled in, their faces pale, their eyes wide. Patricia was crying. Michael looked like he might be sick. The Coast Guard officer, a stern woman named Captain Ellis, helped Richard from the boat to the waiting gurney. "Mr. Morrison, we got a call about 4 hours ago from your daughter. Said their father had fallen overboard and they couldn't find him. They've been searching with us ever since." Richard looked at his children. Patricia's makeup was streaked down her face. Michael couldn't meet his eyes. They'd come back. Or maybe they'd never really left. Maybe they'd circled around, their consciences catching up with their desperation. Maybe they'd realized too late what they'd done. "Dad," Patricia whispered, reaching for his hand. "Dad, I'm so sorry. We're so sorry." Michael was sobbing now, his whole body shaking. "We didn't mean, we were just so desperate. The debt, the pressure. We thought if we just..." "God, Dad, we're monsters." The EMTs were loading Richard into the ambulance. Captain Ellis was asking questions, her eyes sharp and assessing. Richard knew what would happen next. There would be an investigation. His children would likely face charges. Their lives, whatever remained of them, would be ruined. He looked at Patricia and Michael really looked at them. And what he saw weren't the calculating adults who'd pushed him into the sea. He saw two frightened, foolish middle-aged children who'd made a terrible mistake. He saw the weight of that mistake crushing them. He saw the fear and the guilt and the desperate wish that they could take it all back. Richard thought of Margaret, of her endless capacity for forgiveness. He thought of his own father, who'd always said that love meant holding on, even when letting go would be easier. "Captain," Richard said, his voice hoarse but clear, "it was an accident. We were fooling around, and I lost my balance. My kids did everything they could to find me." Captain Ellis frowned. "Mr. Morrison," your daughter said. She was panicking. Richard interrupted. "You know how it is. When someone you love is in danger, you don't always make sense." He looked directly at Patricia and Michael. "They made mistakes today, but they came back. They called for help. That's what matters." The silence stretched long and heavy. Captain Ellis studied Richard's face, then looked at his children, then back at Richard. "If you say so, sir," she finally said, "but you should get checked out at the hospital, and maybe don't go boating for a while." In the days that followed, Richard recovered in the hospital. The doctor said he'd been remarkably lucky. The life vest, the calm water, Carlos and Tony's keen eyes, all of it had combined to save his life. Patricia and Michael visited every day. They sat by his bedside in silence, mostly holding his hands, sometimes crying. Richard didn't have much to say to them. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too raw. But on the fourth day, when Michael finally asked in a broken voice, "Why did you protect us?" Richard found his answer. "Because you're my children," he said simply, "and because I believe people can change. What you did was unforgivable, but I'm choosing to forgive you anyway. Not because you deserve it, because that's what love does." He paused, looking at both of them. "But here's what's going to happen. I'm changing my will. Everything, the house, the accounts, all of it goes to charity. I'll make sure you both have something small, enough to help, but not enough to fight over. And you're both going to therapy, together and separately. If you want any relationship with me for whatever time I have left, that's the price." Patricia nodded, tears streaming. "Anything, Dad, anything." And Richard continued, his voice firm, "You're going to spend the rest of my life showing me that you understand what you almost destroyed. Not money, not inheritance, family, trust, love, the things that actually matter." Michael and Patricia kept their word. Over the months that followed, something shifted. They visited often, but differently than before, not out of obligation or self-interest, but with genuine presence. They brought old photo albums and sat with Richard, remembering Margaret, sharing stories, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. Carlos and Tony Hernandez became unexpected friends. They stopped by the house regularly, bringing fresh fish and easy conversation. Richard learned that Carlos was saving money to start a small restaurant. Tony was putting his daughter through community college. They were good men with good hearts. On a warm evening 6 months later, Richard sat on his porch watching the sunset. Patricia on one side, Michael on the other. The cicadas sang their evening song. The air smelled of jasmine and cut grass. "You know," Richard said quietly, "I think your mother would say we've had quite a year." Patricia laughed. A real laugh, free and light. "She'd have a few choice words for us. That's for sure. She'd also say she was proud," Richard added, "that we found our way back to each other." Michael squeezed his father's hand. "We don't deserve a second chance. None of us deserve the second chances we get," Richard said. "But grace isn't about deserving. It's about deciding that love matters more than justice. That people matter more than mistakes." They sat together in the fading light, three imperfect people, who'd hurt each other and found their way back. It wasn't the family they'd been before. It was something quieter, more honest, built on the fragile foundation of forgiveness and the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust. And Richard, at 87, discovered that even the darkest waters could carry you toward something unexpected. Not the ending you'd imagine, but perhaps the one you needed most. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. If it touched your heart or made you think about what really matters in life, I'd truly appreciate it if you'd click that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear this message. Please subscribe to hear more stories that celebrate the wisdom, resilience, and grace that come with living a full life. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a moment where forgiveness felt impossible but necessary? Your stories matter too. Until next time, may you find peace in your journey, and may you always remember that it's never too late to come home.